Okay, hopefully we're there. I had to take a look at it. Hopefully we are there now. Yeah, I can see we are recording. So it's a story of power and abuse of power. And if we look at the main idea, it says, instead, as the wife of Uriah, she is defined by her relationship to a man. That's wasn't unusual for that time, and unfortunately, it's still not unusual today. At first, it appears that she is silent and powerless, but when she steps onto the stage, she finds her voice and exhibits an ability to influence kings. Bathsheba's story illustrates, again, as I was mentioning, the corrupting influence of power. Can you think about examples? I'm going to put this in our question list. Can you think of examples where power corrupts? I think that's pretty easy to do, isn't it? The ability of power to corrupt is all around us every day. And it happens in the most menial of places and the most simple of places. I think a perfect example of that is the homeowners association. What a great example that is. If you've ever dealt with a homeowner association, and I'm hope not insulting anybody that may have been on a homeowners association, but even those that have been on homeowners associations talk about how suddenly it can become something like almost a little fiefdom. That's kind of a really good example of how power can create its own problems. I'm not saying that it necessarily corrupts, but it does create its own problems. I think we'd agree with that. So why don't we begin with our opening prayer? Why don't you join me in prayer? Creating and loving God, as we read your word together, may we allow it to read us. As we enter into your story, may we understand our own stories with more clarity and wisdom. Help us to remember that you've always worked through the lives of ordinary women and men with all their faults and failings, people like us. We bring our ordinary lives before you today. Transform our expectations so that as we study stories of the past, we may be open to your extraordinary future. And this we pray in your holy name. Amen. So let's begin. Let's go to our introduction. And that's on page 54. Let's begin there. So the first question that is kind of asked of us in that first paragraph, why does Matthew deliberately draw attention to one of David's most shameful acts in naming her as the wife of Uriah? Why is that? Well, obviously, there's certainly a point being made with that. And that point is that here David is taking something, using his power to take someone that doesn't belong to him. And the reason I said something, which is almost like, it's offensive for us today, but it's because back in that time, as we will recall, women were property. And, one of the key commandments is thou shalt not steal, or thou shalt not covet. And here David's making a run at both of them, right? That's Matthew wants us to understand that in his genealogy. That's why he named her the wife of Uriah. The best known story about Bathsheba is from 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 17. And let's just go through what happens here. There's a quick summary here, and it kind of shows you just how horrible this story is. She is bathing on the roof, seen and desired by King David, and then taken, impregnated, and widowed through David's machinations so that he could marry her. I mean, just the outline of that story is terrible enough. And what I think magnifies the terribleness of these acts is that they were by King David, God's king, the one who was, according to the Old Testament scriptures, a person after God's heart, the one who wrote the 23rd Psalm. And we see this terrible act. And then it talks a little bit about the movie David and Bathsheba, how this is a perfect story for Hollywood. Of course, lots of biblical stories make great Hollywood stories, but always they have to be kind of overly dramatized. And the point that our writer makes is that any movie about David and Bathsheba tends to turn it into something of a romance. This is not a romantic story. This has nothing to do with romance whatsoever. And the writer shares with us the ways, the views, which Bathsheba is variously seen. A, the perfect temptress. That kind of relates to the idea of a Jezebel. That's kind of the title that's used. That again comes from the Old Testament. With her seductive ways, she seduces the king. We know that's not true. As a victim of David's power, that's another view, and that's as close to the truth as we're going to get in that viewpoint, that she is a victim of David's power, or simply a cipher, a cardboard, a character with no depth. Well, I think this little study we're going to share is going to prove that that absolutely is not the case. As we see the extent of the story, not just this story from its inception, but how Bathsheba continues to be a presence in the life of David and David's family. She is the mother of Solomon. So these things are going to matter. Our writer says, in any of these characterizations, women may find themselves relating to her or finding her story uncomfortable, or both. Why would that be the case? Why would women relate to her story? That's going to be on your question list as well. Then it says, our author says, if we enter her world and read carefully, what does her story actually tell us about her? What does her story tell us about her? In other words, Bathsheba, like the other women we are studying, invites us into a more complex world where we might find people who, like us, have hopes and dreams and often little power to fulfill them. You have to remember that these are people like us. These we sometimes turn them into characters or fictional characters, but that's not the case. They were people that felt the same things we feel, that struggled with the same feelings we feel, that struggled with the same issues of power. At the top right hand of 54 is one of our first questions. Look at Bathsheba from different points of view, as a manipulator, a victim, or someone who is ignored or treated as totally unimportant. Which viewpoints do you relate to? Either for how you have been viewed yourself or how you have seen other women portrayed, or maybe someone you know who has been pictured as a manipulator or a victim or just completely ignored. That's something you might want to take a few moments to discuss. Now, let's go to the story, 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 13. I don't have the verses in front of me for you, but certainly you can have them in front of you to take a look at. You might even want to, before we go into this part, read that story through, which you are welcome to stop the video and do that if you wish. Here's what grabbed me right from verse 1. And this is something, in reading this story, having read it many times, I never realized before. David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him in the spring of that year, the time when kings go out to battle. But David remained at Jerusalem. Our writer points out that it seems to be a judgment, a subtle and sly dig at David. But I think it's even stronger than that. I mean, when the army, in those days, when the army went out into war, they were led by the king. And we have to ask ourselves, why did David not do what he always did? I mean, how did he begin he led the battle and fought Goliath. That he wasn't even king, he was the shepherd then, the shepherd boy. So why is it he does this so uncharacteristically? And I think what our scripture wants us to understand is that he was plotting, that he did this intentionally. In other words, when David sees Bathsheba taking a bath, it sounds almost incidental. But there may have been a little more plotting to this than we realize. Whatever reason, he remains at Jerusalem. And that's very, very unusual to do so. Plus, it heightens the power of Uriah, Bathsheba's wife. He becomes more important because he then becomes one of the main leaders of the battle. That's very important to the story. So where is David? We don't know. But he's not where he should be. He's not where he should be. I never thought of this before. For those who have argued that Bathsheba deliberately set out to seduce David, we need to realize that she might have expected David all along with all of Israel to be absent and therefore she was able to have a bath safe from prying eyes. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. All I know is that, yes, they had open courtyards. That was a consistently architectural part of building then. They would have open courtyards with open baths, right? And that was not unusual. And perhaps rather being that idea that she didn't expect David to see her, even if David did see her, he was the king. She would have expected him to respect her marriage to one of his chief general. I mean, that she would have thought that would have been important. Furthermore, and this is really to me very, very important, and something that's not missed here, but I think is important, and that is the proximity of Uriah's household to David's, I don't know if you call it castle, but to his fortress, to his residence, to the residence of the king. Proximity was extremely important. The closer you lived to the king, the more important you were as a person because you were needed. You had to be called in immediately if that was the case. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. I mean, Uriah's house was next door. He was the neighbor. He was a neighbor. So even let's think about that, that commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Uriah was a neighbor to the king. So as I said, how many commandments is David breaking here, right? I mean, and it gets worse because then he goes into lying. So it just seems to get worse and worse. So David, who's on his roof, he sees Bathsheba, who is bathing in her enclosed courtyard. But I really think whether it's enclosed or not really doesn't matter because this is the king's actions. The king has the power to move forward or he has the power not to. It falls on David's shoulders, not hers. I think even if she was intending to seduce him for whatever reason, it still felt on his responsibility. He has the power, right? He's got the power to not do this. David's response on seeing Bathsheba is to, quote unquote, inquire about her. Well, what does that mean? He knows who Bathsheba is. Undoubtedly, he's probably socialized with Uriah and Uriah's family. So, what is this inquiry? The answer ties her carefully to two men. The answer to that, who is this person? She is the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Why is it important, do you think, that it was answered to David that way? Why? She is the daughter of Eliam. He doesn't say her name. Oh, that's Bathsheba, your neighbor next door. No, she is the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. There's also kind of a reason to think that it may have been his first time in noticing her because women did not live a public life. They were kept kind of locked away. They were kept in their homes. That was their domain, the household. And that is where they stayed. So if the king had never been in Uriah's household, then he may have never met her or seen her. Okay. Furthermore, if he had met her, she would have been robed, possibly even veiled, might have been the case. So he does not, when he sees her bathing, he does not really know who that is. That's a real possibility of that. Well, David clearly discounts the family ties. Here again, we have that idea of and again, I hate to use this image, but it's true for that time, that Bathsheba is the property of Eliam and the property of Uriah, as was the proper way things were set up at that time. So he discounts both family ties, and in verse 4, he sends people to, and the word here is in quotation marks, to take her. To take her. And that word in Hebrew, as it's used in the Old Testament, is often used for rape. So there is no courtship going on here. And the idea that a king rapes a subject is nothing new, right? I mean, This is, this has gone on for centuries and centuries and centuries. We don't even need to talk about that. But let's also think about the fact that what does this say about David? How do our views on David change? And this is the question on the question sheet. How do our views of David change if he takes her and rapes her? What do you think of David now? I mean, this is, in our culture, he would be charged, arrested, imprisoned for that, if justice was done. So you've got all kinds of issues. You've got also issues of justice going on here. But it certainly makes us rethink who David is. And maybe, and I even don't want to say that this is a human thing, because it's not. It's a power thing. It's an absolute abuse of power. I'm the king, and that's why I can do this. I have the power to do this without anything coming back on me, anything at all, which would have been true in any royal court at that time and later. But something else is at play here besides David's own ability to do what he wants as king, isn't there? As we're going to see in a few minutes. The least powerful person will usually have the least dialogue. So what happens? After the taking, we come to verse 5, and Bathsheba says finally what she's going to say, first time she speaks, in 3 words: I am pregnant. Now, it's really interesting what happens next. If you look at the next part on that paragraph down, it's about the 3rd paragraph down on the left-hand column of 55. The rest of this episode deals with David's increasingly frantic efforts to cover up his crime by bringing Uriah home from battle so that he would spend the night with his wife. Well, my question is, why does David care? Why does he care? I mean, our writer uses the word crime, but he's the king. Kings do not commit crimes. They don't. They create the law. Shakespeare knew this, right? We are the maker of manners, right? From Henry V. We are the makers of manners. So kings don't commit crimes, but yet here we go now into the spiritual element of this story. His crime was the breaking of a commandment against God. His crime was a spiritual one, probably not a legal one. I would think not a legal one. I don't think then that laws, at least any of the practical laws, affected the king. But certainly, he had broken some spiritual. I mean, he had. So what's he trying to do here? Why is he, they always say, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up, right? Why is he so frantically trying to cover it up? Well, I can think of 3 reasons, possibly, why this mattered to King David at all, that she had become pregnant. First, his reputation, right? He is the king after God's own heart. So he's well aware of that reputation. I mean, he's the writer of psalms, the singer of hymns, the spiritual leader of Israel. He is. He's not just the king. He is their spiritual as well as political leader. And God has supported David, right? I mean, David's known this from the very beginning, that God has supported him. So now he is trying to protect his reputation. He does not want to be the fallen king spiritually. Secondly, responsibility. Why does it matter? Well, I mean, because, he's supposed to appear responsible to the people. And here he has taken a huge fall from that. And because it is a spiritual violation, he can certainly be held accountable, as we're going to see in just a few minutes. Finally, there's the issue of relationship with Uriah. He depends on Uriah. Uriah is one of his top generals. And he depends on Uriah to do the job that generals do, which is win battles. So he certainly does not want to destroy that relationship, which could put his own kingdom at risk. It can put his own kingdom at risk. I think we would agree with that. In case you're wondering why I'm bending down occasionally, I want to be sure the red light is running as we're recording this. So, what does he do? Well, he tries to he brings Uriah back for, I guess, a conference of some type. And Uriah, we see Uriah's own moral center in the fact that he is at that time in the midst of a battle, the army's in the field, and he is not going to break his own code, his own moral code. In other words, I think it's kind of the thing of, look, you call me in, but no, I'm not going to spend time at home. My men are not spending time at home, and I'm not going to either. There are quite a couple of good movies out. I think the one that comes to mind immediately is We Were Soldiers, the one with Mel Gibson, where Mel Gibson, who plays the colonel who's leading that battle in Vietnam, says, I will be the first one to step off of that helicopter, and I'll be the last one to step on. I will not leave my men. So we see that's a kind of a theme that we see that emerges here. Uriah's, he's home from the battle, but he's not going to spend the night with his wife. David even tries to get him drunk, tries to get him intoxicated. But again, Uriah is not going to break his own moral code. And you can imagine what that does to David. I mean, things just get worse and worse in David's actions. So what does he do? He decides to escalate, as our writer says, escalate deception to murder. So he sends Uriah back to the army, as our writer says, carrying his own death warrant. Joab lets David know that he is aware of his underhanded scheme by telling his messenger to remind David of the death of Abimelech in Judges 9, who was shamefully killed by a woman. David's reply to Joab in verse 25 here is the equivalent of a shrugged, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. What I think he's really saying as I read that verse is, well, that's war. That's war. Put him up front. That's just, those are my orders. Follow my orders. This is war. This is where I want him to be. Let's take that old line that's been said and heard many times, and you've heard it. All's fair in love and war. What do you think about that? Take a moment. That'll be on your question list. Take a moment to talk about that. All's fair in love and war. Is that true? First of all, why is that even said in the first place? And why is it true or not true? Let's think about that. Okay, so if you, as our writer says, in case we're left wondering if we are allowed to be appalled by David's action, the narrator steps in to make it very clear that God is appalled by David's action. And sometimes the verses can be so subtle, but their subtlety reflects something much greater. And in this case, it is, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That's kind of a subtle way of saying, and usually in the Hebrew, it's actually a much stronger phrase. In fact, it reads more strongly in the Hebrew, closer to evil bad was the thing which David had done. So now David has placed himself into a place of judgment, and that's going to happen. Now we come to 2 Samuel 12, which to me is one, you talk about a preachable story. This is a story that is so preachable. I've preached on it many times. It is truly one of the great morality tales in all the Old Testament. And I think almost my favorite story in the Old Testament. And this is where Nathan, the prophet, comes in and tells this little parable to the king about this poor man whose one lamb was taken by a very rich man, taken away from the rich man, and then the rich man had the poor man killed. It's an incredible story. And there's a play on words. I won't go into that. On the right side of page 55, you might want to look at that. There's a play on words. But regardless, when Nathan brings the story to David, and he's the prophet. So here's the voice of God speaking to David directly. That's how David is to hear it, as the voice of God. David is outraged by it. And of course, being the king, he wants to exact judgment upon this. And Nathan says those perfect words. I mean, absolutely. One of the best 4 words in the Old Testament. You are the man. You can almost see the blood draining, the blood of the collar, the red, the anger draining out of David's face as he realized that he has done this horrible thing. Now, let's move to one of the more difficult parts of the story, which is highlighted at the bottom on page 55, right-hand side. God's judgment. The death of the child in verses 14 through 23. How do we even deal with that? On page 56, the question is asked of us. The death of a child is a difficult judgment to read here. It may lead us to ask, what sort of God takes it out on an innocent baby? We need to read for the symbolism of the story. What do you think is happening here symbolically? That's a tough question. And it goes to a lot of questions that we ask out of the Old Testament. How could God do these things? But let's remember, for me, more than a symbol, it's the perspective of the story. This is how David saw the death of his child. And isn't it true that a lot of times when bad things happen to us or bad things happen to others, we or someone else start searching for the reason that it happened? What did I do to deserve this? What have I done to deserve this? Which is, of course, as Christians, a question we're not even to ask. I mean, Jesus gave us eternal life, the great gift, the greatest gift of all. But it's a natural human thing, particularly for believers sometimes, to go, what have I done? And that was an absolute principle in the religion of Israel, that if something bad happened to you, then you were being punished by God for something that either you did or your ancestors did. So it was a reasonable thing for David to ask. And that's his perspective, that God killed this child because of this terrible thing that he had done. So I think it's a matter of perspective. And we're getting David's perspective on this. The child died, as many children did then. Childbirth was hazardous. Very few survived. Very few women survived childbirth. You had to have a number of children to have any to reach adulthood. So it would have been not unusual for a child to die. But in this case, David connects it directly. I mean, Nathan, the prophet said, you're the person. Now Nathan didn't give a judgment. Nathan just pointed out, God knows what you did. God knows what you did. And you can imagine how that must have weighed upon David, his total failure in all of this. So, the next question that's asked after that question on 56 is, what does Bathsheba think and feel through all of this? Well, we don't know, do we? But then, she's continuously called the wife of Uriah until after the death of the child. Only then does the narrative recognize her as David's wife. Punishment has happened and a transition takes place. At this stage, she conceives, and childbearing was always a blessing. If the child was healthy, she conceives and bears the child Jedediah, beloved of the Lord, and that is the one who would become Solomon, the great wise king and successor to David. So in a sense, the child in verse 25 is for David a sign of forgiveness and hope. We know David repents in his response to the death of the child. He repents of God. And then he suddenly discovers hope in the birth of this child from Bathsheba. The question that's asked, the parable told by Nathan provides an important interpretive key to the David and Bathsheba story. Does this reading change your understanding of what you may have heard about Bathsheba? How is Bathsheba's portrayal as a temptress similar to modern reporting of victims of assault? And we know there is definitely a modern analogy to this, as we've seen in court cases, in all these different things. In media, you know that this is true. So we see a movement, as our author points out, from sin to repentance, okay? And then here comes Solomon. Okay, but let's also remember that there's another judgment here that Nathan did say, which is, the sword shall never depart from your house. The sword shall never depart from your house. And as we read the rest of the story of David, we see how true that is. The rest of David's life as king is filled with violence, rebellion from his own children, and all kinds of difficult, problematic issues. So, now we go to 1 Kings 1:11-31, and now the wife of Uriah the Hittite is Solomon's mother. So now she begins to take her place as a prince's mother and acts as a prince's mother. As a favorite of the king, Bathsheba might expect special consideration for herself as well as for her son. This is clearly the case as Nathan the prophet persuades Bathsheba to approach the king rather than doing so himself. Here our author talks about the harem, the Middle Eastern harems. If you've ever seen the movie The King and I, that's a story of a harem. And if you will recall, the crown prince's mother is the leader of the women in the harem. If you take a look at that movie, you'll see that that is the case. So that's really kind of based upon that Middle Eastern kind of despotic way, if you want to call it despotic, but way that kings operated and way courts operated. So she takes Nathan's words and creatively adapts them to paint a vivid picture of a coup on the part of Adonijah, David's oldest son. Who, being the oldest, of course, is the crown prince, basically, right? But Bathsheba wants to elevate Solomon. Now, why would David be even sympathetic to what Bathsheba is saying? Because you got to remember, David was the younger one among all of his brothers. And God chose David. And you remember, he was anointed. He was anointed to be king. God chose David over the other brothers of the other sons of Jesse. So you have to remember that story. So David would certainly be open to believing Solomon, and perhaps Solomon also showed the kind of talent and cleverness and ability to be the king. So we have to think of that as well. It says down toward the middle on page 56, ancient Near East palace politics had particular roles assigned to the women of the harem, especially the mother of the king or the named successor. Supporting her own son was not only the natural task of a mother, but the wise action of a first lady, hoping to prevent a series of assassinations and wars after the death of a king as the king's son fought for rule. It was up to the king to choose who would be his successor. And that's important. So then we get to the final appearance of Bathsheba in 1 King, which supports this whole idea. Described again as Solomon's mother, this is on page 57. She is approached to intercede with King Solomon on behalf of Adonijah. Now, Adonijah has lost his place in line, right? So Adonijah wants to marry David's last and youngest woman, Abishag. Let me get these characters straight. Solomon sits Bathsheba on a throne at his right hand, clearly a position of great power. Solomon hears her, though he refuses her request for Adonijah because he can see the deeper implications of the proposed marriage. Adonijah's alliance with Abishag would allow him to undermine Solomon's throne and begin a bid for power himself. So Adonijah is not one of David's sons, but he is a rival. He is a rival for Solomon, who's already been designated, right, the crown prince. So my apologies, I'm getting those characters a little mixed up. So why does Bathsheba do this? Why did she? It seems that she does this out of sympathy for Adonijah, right? It seems that she does this out of sympathy. But she does not do that. Okay, I'm getting all mixed up here. I'm not sure what it means when she says David's last and youngest woman. Okay, in the harem. She is a kept woman, Abishag, in the harem of David. So Adonijah goes and go to Bathsheba and says, I would like to marry her, and marry her specifically, right? So there's a reason for that. So I don't think Bathsheba, in bringing this request to David, as she would do, being the first mother or first wife in the harem, I don't think she's doing this necessarily out of sympathy for Adonijah. She's probably, by making this request, exposing the possibility of a plot. David picks up on it immediately. Despite the horrible beginnings, top of page 57, we see Bathsheba rise with considerable grace and skill to make the most of the position she is allowed. Her efforts on behalf of her son aid the transition of kingship from David to Solomon without the threat of destruction that is always just under the surface. When Bathsheba comes with Adonijah's request to marry Abishag, David immediately recognizes what's going on and lays out very clearly, if you read the story, this is what Adonijah's doing. He's going to supplant Solomon. I've made my decision. So whether Bathsheba expected this or not, I think we've got to be really careful here. I think what our author is doing is elevating Bathsheba, drawing out her personhood in her willingness and her power, her use of power to preserve peace. So in this story, we have two competing uses of power. One by King David, which is just simply evil. His actions, the way he uses power, are evil. On the other hand, Bathsheba's use of her power keeps peace for Israel, and that would be the reason why she would be included in the genealogy in Matthew. Yes, it is true, he did call her the wife of Uriah, but that would make perfect sense for Matthew to do so. That encapsulates the whole story, that she played a crucial role in continuing the line from Solomon that led to the birth of Jesus Christ. So now we come to a really clear understanding of why Matthew, in just identifying her as the wife of Uriah, opened up all that understanding to the readers who would have known this story. They would have known this story. So she used her power to maintain peace for the kingdom. David used his power to shatter the peace of his family, and shattering a peace that continued to judge him for the rest of his life. So the final question that is asked on page 57 is, who are the women of influence you have admired? How have they fought for the wider good of the community? And that will be on your question list as well. Thanks for your patience. This may be kind of a jittery tape, which I've made for you. I had to interrupt it to get an important phone call, which I did get, and I apologize for that. But I hope that in going through this gives you plenty of fodder to think about and things to talk about. So why don't we conclude with the prayer that we find on page on lesson 6. And I will read it, and you may pray it, or if you'd like to follow along verbally, you may do so. Healing God. In Bathsheba, we see all the women who have been used by others to increase someone else's power. Women bought and sold or used as accessories. Women whose bodies have been used in advertising. Women seen only in terms of how they further a man's prestige and not for the persons they are. We find ourselves here too, worrying about how we look, whether we are becoming invisible with age, and if our choices are slipping away from us. Help us see the growing character of Bathsheba all around us, in women who remain themselves through their challenges, women who fight for the good of their children, women who work hard to keep their families going, women who manage to find their own strength in the midst of the things that are done to them. God of healing, help us to hear each other's stories and gain strength from what we hear. Help us see the hope and humanity in all women, in all people, rather than the carefully manipulated images someone else presents to us. Help us to understand that real power lies in knowing that we are your children and that nothing can separate us from you. Amen. Thank you so much. And as I said, I'll be back in the fall as we begin to look at our next Presbyterian Women Bible Study. God bless you all.